They laughed when I walked in. Not a cruel teenage kind of laugh, worse. The kind adults use when they've already decided who you are. My father was the loudest. "Oh, look, the trader is here," he announced to the room full of guests, his voice echoing off the chandeliers. "Still doing that little side hustle, sweetheart?" My brother Logan raised his glass, smirking. "She calls it investing, Dad. I call it gambling with Wi-Fi." The table erupted. I smiled like it didn't sting, but inside every word landed like glass against my ribs. They didn't know I'd been trading silence for patience, and that patience was about to make me dangerous. The night smelled like cinnamon and arrogance. The Wynn family's annual Christmas party was always a performance, my father Richard in his tailored suit, my mother Eleanor floating between guests with a glass of champagne pretending her smile was natural. Logan holding court near the fireplace surrounded by admirers. He was the golden child founder of Nimbus Pay. Richard's favorite son, the one everyone called brilliant. I was the quiet one, the safe one, the daughter who'd chosen data analytics instead of risk. I arrived late on purpose, hoping to slip through unnoticed, but Dad spotted me instantly. "Clara, you actually made it. We thought your little trading experiment kept you busy." He used that tone again, half amusement, half dismissal. Guests turned to look at me, curious. I forced a laugh. "It's doing okay, Dad." "Okay," Logan echoed, grinning. "You mean profitable? Or just another spreadsheet hobby?" Sophie, his fiancée, chimed in from behind her red lipstick smile. "She probably plays with stock apps the way I shop online." The laughter came again, polite and poisonous. I glanced at the massive tree glittering in the corner, the $100 ornaments reflecting their smiles. I'd spent the past 3 years trading markets worth billions, but somehow I still felt like the smallest person in that room. Dinner was announced, roasted turkey wine older than I was, and a long mahogany table that could seat 20. The clinking of silverware filled the silence as Richard started talking about Wynn Capital's new global expansion. He didn't mention that the firm's performance had been mediocre for 2 years straight. He didn't need to. No one questioned Richard Wynn. Mom beamed at Logan as he bragged about Nimbus Pay's next round of funding. "We're projecting a $200 million valuation," he said proudly. Dad clapped him on the shoulder. "That's my boy. A real visionary." Then, like clockwork, all eyes shifted to me. "And you," Clara, Dad said with an indulgent smile. "How's your project going?" "What do you call it again? Luma something. Luma Quant," I said softly. He chuckled. Right. Sounds important. So is it still just you and your laptop?" I took a sip of wine. "Yes, just me. And a few algorithms." Logan leaned back, smirking. "Come on, sis. You can't call it a business if it fits in your backpack." "Actually," I said evenly, "it fits in the cloud." Sophie laughed. "Oh, she's witty tonight." I smiled again, the same practiced smile I'd used my whole life. Small, quiet, unbothered. My hand under the table, though, was gripping my fork hard enough to leave marks. Dad raised his glass. "Well, here's to real businesses. The kind that builds families, not fantasies." I raised mine, too. "To families," I said, and took a long drink. For a moment, I wondered what would happen if they knew. If they had the slightest idea that the tiny side hustle they mocked had quietly grown into a trading empire, managing over $3 billion in assets. If they knew I was already being courted by Forbes and Bloomberg. If they knew I'd funded their so-called visionary son's startup through a silent venture entity he thought belonged to an anonymous investor. But revenge is a dish best served under NDA. So I stayed silent. Dinner rolled on with more stories of Logan's triumphs, more backhanded compliments about my discipline. Mom finally leaned toward me and whispered, "You know your father just worries you're wasting your potential." I nodded. "Sure, Mom. Worry looks a lot like mockery these days." She sighed. "He doesn't mean to hurt you. Intent doesn't erase impact," I murmured. Logan tapped his glass. "Hey, sis. Remember when you offered to invest in Nimbus Pay years ago? What was it, $5,000? I didn't answer." He laughed. "It's cute, really. You should have just asked me for shares. I might have given you a symbolic one." Dad joined in, chuckling. Oh, Logan, don't tease your sister. That was serious business, right, Clara? Her little stock hobby. I looked at him steady. You're right, Dad. It was serious. Still is. He nodded, not catching the double meaning. Good. Keep at it. Maybe one day you'll run your own little fund. Maybe I already do. They didn't hear the warning in my tone. They never did. Later, when dessert was served and laughter filled the air again, my phone buzzed under the table. A message from Sarah Holmes. Forbes editorial feature confirmed for Jan issue. Title: The Billionaire Trader Behind Luma Quant. Final draft approved. I stared at the screen, pulse steady, lips curving just slightly. Something funny, Logan asked. I looked up. Just business. Dad clinked his glass again. Now that's the spirit. Maybe this will be the year your little project pays off. Maybe, I said. You'll know soon enough. As the night wound down, snow began to fall outside. Guests drifted home, tipsy and loud. Dad patted my shoulder before disappearing into his office. You did well tonight, Clara. Learn to laugh at yourself. That's maturity. Or strategy, I said quietly, but he was already gone. When the house finally emptied, I stood alone by the window watching the snow. My reflection stared back, calm, precise, unrecognizable from the girl they used to dismiss. I whispered to the glass. Maturity doesn't build empires. Focus does. My phone buzzed again, a reminder notification, Forbes feature goes live. 8:00 a.m. EST, 8 hours. 8 hours until the world learned that the woman they called useless had outperformed Wall Street. 8 hours until my father's real business learned who his biggest investor really was. I turned off the phone and smiled faintly. Merry Christmas, Dad. The snow kept falling quiet and steady, like profit compounding in the dark. The world woke up before I did. My phone was already vibrating when the first ray of Manhattan light slipped through the blinds. Not the usual hum of alerts from trading apps, this was chaos. Notifications stacked like falling dominoes. Bloomberg, CNBC, Reuters, Forbes. The screen glowed with one headline repeating itself over and over. Meet Clara Wynn, the billionaire trader who outsmarted Wall Street. I blinked, exhaled, and whispered to the empty room. So it's real now. Down on Fifth Avenue, the city moved like nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. Coffee, laptop, calm breathing, or the closest thing to it. I opened my trading dashboard just to ground myself in something familiar. The numbers were still green. The algorithms had executed perfectly overnight, clean and unemotional. But the phone kept buzzing louder, more insistent. CNBC. We'd love you on live this morning. Forbes. Your feature's trending top 3 globally. Wynn Capital PR. We need to confirm family connection before statement release. That last one froze me. Wynn Capital, my father's firm. So Richard knew. I stared at the message for a long second, coffee cooling beside me. Then quietly I smiled. When I finally checked my voicemail, his voice was there. Calm, controlled, but with that edge of disbelief I'd been waiting to hear all my life. Clara. I saw the article. We need to talk. Call me before this gets out of hand. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the skyline. It was already out of hand, just not for me. By mid-morning, my apartment looked like a newsroom. Emails, calls, news anchors rehearsing my name as if they'd always known it. Clara Wynn, founder of Luma Quant, youngest billionaire trader on Forbes' list. The words didn't sound real yet. Billionaire, trader, Forbes. Once those had been fantasies scribbled in notebooks during long nights of debugging algorithms. Now they were reality, and the world couldn't stop repeating them. I scrolled through the feature again. Wynn's revolutionary AI-based trading system, Luma Quant, has quietly generated returns surpassing 40% annually, outperforming every major hedge fund. Sources confirm her fund now manages over $3 billion. It was all true. But the part that mattered most wasn't there the years they didn't see. The nights of ramen and code. The mornings of watching markets open while my father laughed over breakfast. The silence after every, "you'll understand real business someday." My phone buzzed again. Logan. I hesitated, then answered. "Hey," I said. His voice came sharp, panicked. "Clara, what the hell? Is this a joke? Forbes just named you a billionaire? Dad's losing it, it's not a joke." He didn't respond for a moment. I could almost hear him calculating. "You made $3 billion. Trading, not trading," I corrected. "Building," he scoffed. "That's insane. You live in a one-bedroom apartment and drive a 10-year-old car." "Yeah," I said softly. "That's how you keep $3 billion. He exhaled hard. "You should have told us." "I tried," I said. You all laughed. Silence. Then quieter. "Dad wants you to come to the office. He says this could be complicated." "Complicated for who?" "For him," Logan admitted. "He's on the board of Wynn Capital and the press just connected Richard's name. Tell him I'll stop by after lunch." By the time I arrived at Wynn Capital, the lobby screens were already flashing the headline. Wynn Capital CEO's daughter is Forbes' youngest billionaire. The receptionist looked up startled, as if I'd stepped out of the headline itself. "Ms. Wynn, your father's waiting." He was standing by the window when I entered his office, back turned, phone in hand. His voice was calm, too calm. "Yes, of course we're proud. She's brilliant, but Luma Quant is independent. Yes, completely separate from Wynn Capital." He ended the call and finally turned to me. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "you've caused quite a storm." I crossed my arms. Didn't mean to. He laughed once short and bitter. "Forbes doesn't accidentally call someone a billionaire." "You hid this, Clara." "From me? From your mother? From everyone?" I met his gaze steadily. "I didn't hide it. You just never asked." He shook his head. "You had no right to what, build something on my own, be more than your side hustle daughter." He looked away. "You embarrassed this family." "Embarrassed," I repeated, almost laughing. "I just made your last 3 decades of investment returns look amateur. You should be thanking me for the brand boost." His jaw tightened. "That attitude will destroy you." I smiled faintly. "No, Dad. It already built me." He fell silent, then the kind of silence that hums louder than words. Finally, he said quietly, "The board wants to meet you." I raised an eyebrow. "To congratulate me, to assess potential conflicts," he said. "You've become news. They're nervous." I nodded slowly. "Fine. Let's give them something to really be nervous about." That afternoon, I sat in the Wynn Capital boardroom, a room where I'd once been told to fetch coffee when shadowing as a college intern. Now the same men who had ignored me were shifting uncomfortably in their leather chairs. "Ms. Wynn," one of them began carefully, "congratulations on your success. Of course, given your familial ties, there's the matter of reputational overlap. Perhaps a joint statement?" "No," I said flatly. "Luma Quant stands alone. Always has." A murmur rippled across the table. One man cleared his throat. "Your father's firm has benefited greatly from the Wynn name. Surely cooperation could—" "I don't do legacy trades," I interrupted. "I build new markets." Dad shot me a warning look, but I didn't care. I stood. "Gentlemen, I didn't come here for permission. I came to make something clear. You may share my last name, but not my limits." The room went dead quiet. When I walked out, Dad's voice followed me, softer now, almost uncertain. "Clara, what happens next?" I turned back at the door. "The market decides, Dad. It always does." Outside, reporters were waiting, shouting questions, flashes popping like gunfire. "Clara, how does it feel to be Forbes' youngest billionaire? Is it true your father didn't know will Luma Quant partner with Wynn Capital?" I smiled for the cameras. "No comment. But tell Forbes their math was right." As I stepped into the waiting car, my phone buzzed again, another message from Forbes. "Your story hit 10 million reads in 6 hours, trending worldwide." I stared out the window as Manhattan blurred past skyscrapers glowing like circuits. "Once upon a time," my father laughed at my algorithms. Now they were rewriting his legacy. And this was only day one. The last time I sat in this room, they told me I didn't belong here. Now they couldn't start the meeting without me. Wynn Capital's executive boardroom gleamed like an altar marble table, polished steel city skyline stretching behind floor-to-ceiling glass. I used to watch this view from the street as an intern clutching coffee and ambition. Today the men who once called me kiddo were whispering my name with careful respect. The only person who hadn't spoken was my father, sitting at the head of the table, like a dethroned king trying to remember what power used to feel like. "Let's begin," he said finally, his voice tight. A senior partner cleared his throat. "This emergency session is to discuss the market impact of Forbes' revelation. Ms. Wynn's fund, Luma Quant, now represents a potential influence over the trading volume of several sectors Wynn Capital actively manages. We need clarity." Clarity. That was their polite word for control. I leaned forward. "You're afraid I'll compete with you?" The partner smiled thinly. "We're concerned about perception." I folded my hands. "Then let me be clear. I don't compete with Wynn Capital. You compete with me." Across the table, someone coughed. Dad's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Another voice, softer, older. "Clara, we've all watched you grow up here. This company bears your family's name. Surely we can find a collaborative way forward." I smiled. I built my own name. Luma Quant didn't need Wynn Capital's blessing. The room went still. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the rhythm of my own pulse. Finally, Dad spoke. "Enough. This isn't a competition. Wynn Capital is a legacy firm. We manage clients' portfolios, family offices. Luma Quant is a predictive AI trading system outperforming your top funds by 30%. I finished. He looked at me sharply. "That's not what this meeting is about." "It's exactly what this meeting is about," I said. "You can call it concern, but what you really mean is embarrassment. You mocked my tiny side hustle, and now it's bigger than your empire." A few of the directors exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected the conversation to turn into family therapy. One of them, a lean man with silver-rimmed glasses, spoke cautiously. "We're all on the same team here, Ms. Wynn. Surely your father's reputation—" "His reputation," I interrupted, "is his. Mine was earned." The silence was heavier this time. Even Dad didn't fill it. After a moment, the chairman leaned forward. "So what do you propose, Ms. Wynn? A partnership? A merger?" I shook my head. "Neither. I came here to tell you that Luma Quant is expanding. We'll be opening a fund targeting underrepresented founders and women in finance, the kind you overlook while chasing the next alpha male CEO." Someone shifted uncomfortably. "You mean—" "A social equity fund, I mean a profitable one," I said. "Ethics scale better than ego." Dad exhaled, rubbing his temple. "You think you can lecture this board about ethics, about markets? You're 30. I'm 30 and Forbes just listed me next to Warren Buffett," I replied quietly. "You're 62 and still think patience is weakness. Maybe you should have asked how I did it." He stared at me across the table. For a second, I saw something in his eyes. Not anger, not pride, just confusion. The same look he'd given me the first time I beat him at chess when I was 9. He'd moved his queen without realizing I'd already set the trap. "Are you done?" he asked softly. "Not yet." I turned to the rest of the board. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone, but you should know that the next decade belongs to firms that adapt. The old way greed secrecy hierarchy, it's dead. Transparency and technology win now. If you can't accept that you'll be extinct before the next Christmas party—" The oldest partner adjusted his cufflinks. "That sounds like a threat." I stood. "It's a forecast." Dad didn't stop me when I walked out. He just said my name once quietly. "Clara." I paused at the door. His voice dropped. "Don't destroy what we built." I looked back. "Then stop pretending you built all of it." Outside, the elevator doors slid open. My reflection stared back at me in the mirrored walls, poised calm, untouchable. But when the doors closed, I felt the adrenaline kick in. The conversation replayed in flashes, Dad's face, the shock in the director's eyes, my own voice steady, like I'd practiced it for years. When the elevator reached the lobby, my assistant Tessa was waiting. "They're calling you the ICE algorithm online," she said, holding out her phone. I read the headline on a finance blog. Forbes billionaire Clara freezes out Wynn Capital in family boardroom showdown. I laughed softly. Creative. Is it true you turned down a merger? It's true I didn't need one. Tessa smiled almost in awe. You realize your father's CEO just followed you on LinkedIn? Good, I said. He'll need the updates. As we stepped out onto the sidewalk, the winter air sliced through the city. Reporters were already waiting across the street, microphones, ready cameras, flashing. Clara, how does it feel to be Forbes' youngest billionaire? Is it true your father didn't know will Luma Quant partner with Wynn Capital? I smiled for the cameras. No comment. But tell Forbes' their math was right. As I stepped into the waiting car, my phone buzzed again, another message from Forbes. Your story hit 10 million reads in 6 hours. Trending worldwide. I stared out the window as Manhattan blurred past skyscrapers glowing like circuits. Once upon a time, my father laughed at my algorithms. Now they were rewriting his legacy. And this was only day one. When the storm finally came, it didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like applause. Wall Street Forbes' every outlet from Bloomberg to Vanity Fair, everyone wanted the same thing, the story behind the woman who'd built a billion-dollar empire in silence. They called me the ghost trader, the algorithm queen, the enigma of Luma Quant. What they didn't know was that silence hadn't been a strategy, it had been survival. For years I learned to disappear in a family that only valued volume. Now they were the ones drowning in the noise I never needed to make. By the third morning after the Forbes article, my apartment was buried under bouquets and interview requests. My inbox looked like a stock chart in free fall. CNN, the New York Times, TED Talks. Every network wanted me to tell my story. The irony was thick. They mocked me when I had none to tell. Now they begged me for the version that sold. I declined them all except one. Forbes had earned it. The interview was set for Thursday morning at their Manhattan headquarters. As I dressed, a simple black suit, hair in a loose knot. No jewelry, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Calm, professional, unapologetic. The woman staring back wasn't the one they'd called useless at last Christmas dinner. She was someone else, someone who'd turned humiliation into a portfolio strategy. Under the studio lights, the interviewer smiled. So, Clara, how does it feel to wake up and see yourself called a billionaire expensive, I said. But not surprising. What's the secret? There isn't one. Just consistency, discipline, patience. Your father called it a side hustle. I smiled faintly. He also thought email was a fad. After the interview, the Forbes producer ushered me out. Outside, the January air was sharp. My phone buzzed. Logan again. I ignored the first 3 calls. The fourth came with a message. Answer. It's urgent. I sighed and answered. What now, Logan? Dad's furious, he said. He's getting calls from investors asking if Wynn Capital's under your control. Maybe they should be more concerned about why they think that I said. This isn't funny, Clara. He's demanding you make a public statement. Everyone who matters knows the truth, I replied, including him. Logan's voice softened. He's scared, Clara. He built everything on his reputation. You shattered it overnight. I didn't shatter it. I just made it transparent. By the way, Logan, my security team just flagged some unusual cross-trading activity. It looks like someone was trying to mirror my algorithms through a shell company in Zurich called Nimbus Holdings. There was a beat of absolute silence on the line. Nimbus? Holdings, he finally managed. His voice was too thin. Yes. You sound like you've heard of it. I'm having the data verified now. Tell Dad I'll stop by after lunch. And Logan, don't make this more complicated than it already is. I hung up, the city wind biting harder. The price of silence has always been loneliness. But tonight, for the first time, it felt like freedom too. The call came at dawn when the city was still asleep and the markets hadn't opened yet. My father never called before 8, never without warning. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual polish. "Clara," he said, "we need to talk. At the office. Now." I almost laughed. The last time he summoned me, it was to scold me for investing too emotionally. Now I was the headline he couldn't control. Outside my window, Manhattan's skyline was fading from gold to gray, and for the first time in years I realized he sounded afraid. When I arrived at Wynn Capital, the lobby was chaotic. Assistants moved like ghosts whispering. Everyone looked up when I walked through the glass doors. The receptionist's face was pale. "He's waiting in the main conference room," she murmured. The elevator ride was long enough for my pulse to settle. I already knew what this was. It wasn't a meeting, it was a reckoning. The doors opened. Inside, my father stood by the window, sleeves rolled up, eyes bloodshot. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat beside a folder thick with documents. Across the table sat two of Wynn Capital's senior partners and an unfamiliar man in a dark suit, Clara, Dad said, without looking at me. "This is Michael Pierce, counsel for the firm." The lawyer nodded, expression unreadable. "Ms. Wynn, we appreciate you coming in." I sat folding my hands. "What's this about?" My father turned, finally meeting my eyes. "We have a problem." "Define a problem." He pushed the folder across the table. Inside, printouts, charts, and a letter stamped with the seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I frowned. "An audit?" He nodded stiffly. "They're reviewing cross-trading patterns between Wynn Capital accounts and your fund, Luma Quant." "That's impossible," I said immediately. "We've never shared data. They think otherwise." I flipped through the pages. Lines of transactions, identical timestamps, mirrored trades. Someone was making it look like I'd been front-running Wynn Capital's moves using insider information to profit. "This is fabricated," I said. Dad's voice was tight. "It doesn't matter what it is. Perception is reality in this business. Wynn Capital's board is panicking. They think you leaked client information to build your portfolio." "Unbelievable," I muttered. "And you? What do you think?" He hesitated. That was enough. "Then let me make it simple," I said, meeting his gaze. "I built Luma Quant on independent data models, clean code, and patience. The only connection between us is a coordinated attack. As I told Logan yesterday, my team flagged the trading conduit Nimbus Holdings in Zurich." Dad and the senior partners exchanged worried glances. "How did you know about Nimbus Holdings?" Dad asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Because unlike you, I trust my algorithms more than my legacy. My initial analysis points directly back to internal credentials at Wynn Capital that initiated the leak using Nimbus Holdings as a smokescreen to mimic my trades and frame Luma Quant." He shook his head. "You actually believe it," I said. "After everything, you still think I'd cheat to beat you? I don't know what to believe anymore." For a moment, the room tilted. The betrayal didn't sting, it burned. "Then let me make it simple," I said. "I built Luma Quant on independent data models, clean code, and patience. You want proof, I'll give you every line of my architecture. You'll see there's nothing dirty in it, unlike this firm." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Ms. Wynn, please. We're not accusing you. We're assessing exposure. If there's even a perception of impropriety, I know how this works." I cut in. "I used to write your compliance reports for free." Dad slammed a hand on the table. "Enough. This isn't about old wounds, Clara. This is about the family name." "No," I said coldly. "This is about you realizing that your name isn't untouchable anymore." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut air. Finally, the lawyer spoke again, measured. "The SEC will want cooperation. If you can provide access to your systems, it would expedite matters." "Done," I said. Dad blinked. "Just like that transparency doesn't scare me," I said. "But you should ask yourself why someone would target us both." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I leaned back. "Think. Wynn Capital's been bleeding senior clients for months. You're losing market share. Then suddenly a scandal that links your firm and mine appears, something that could destroy both of us. Who benefits?" Dad's expression shifted. For a man who built his life on reading risk, he'd missed the most obvious one. By noon, I was back in my office, screens lit with data streams. My lead analyst, Tessa, rushed in. I ran diagnostics on our trade logs, she said breathlessly. There's no breach. But someone mirrored our patterns for 2 weeks straight. The trades originated from a shell account in Zurich. Owner listed under Nimbus Holdings. I froze. Nimbus? She nodded. As in Nimbus Pay. Logan's company. I stood so quickly my chair hit the wall. Pull every timestamp, every transaction. Now. Tessa hesitated. Clara, if this connects back to him, it already does. That evening I drove straight to Nimbus Pay's downtown office. The lobby guard looked startled when I walked in unannounced. I'm here to see Logan win. He called upstairs, stammered something, then waved me through. Logan's assistant met me at the elevator. He's in a meeting. Not anymore, I said, brushing past her. The glass doors to his office swung open. He was there standing behind his desk mid-sentence with 2 executives. His face drained when he saw me. Everyone out, I said. The men glanced at Logan, unsure. He nodded weakly. They left. What the hell? Clara, he said, closing the door behind them. You can't just... I tossed the folder onto his desk. The SEC letter landed on top. You want to explain this? He blinked, then forced a laugh. What is this? You tell me, I said. Someone mirrored my trades. Every timestamp, every move. Guess which shell company it came from? His face went pale. You think I don't think so. I know. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Look, maybe someone in our analytics team used your patterns for simulation. It's not illegal, I snapped. It's a fraud, Logan, and it's about to bring down Dad's firm and mine. I didn't authorize that, then find out who did. Because if this hits the press, you're finished. And if you don't fix it, I will. He slammed his fist on the desk. You think you're so perfect? You think you're the only one who worked for success? No, I said quietly. But I'm the only one who didn't cheat to get it. I turned to leave, but he called after me. Clara, you can't go public with this. I looked over my shoulder. Watch me. When I stepped back onto the street, the winter wind hit like a blade. The city buzzed with energy, indifferent, relentless. My phone vibrated again, a text from Tessa. Clara, the SEC's requesting a joint hearing. You and Wynn Capital. Tomorrow morning. Perfect. For once the stage would be level. As I walked away, the lights of the city reflected off the glass towers, cold, sharp, and endless. I whispered to myself, you wanted real business, Dad. Welcome to it. The conference room at the Securities and Exchange Commission smelled of recycled air and fear. I'd been in hundreds of boardrooms, but never one where the temperature dropped every time someone said my name. Rows of executives, attorneys, and analysts lined the long glass table. The fluorescent lights made everything look sterile, unforgiving. At the far end sat the panel 3 officials with the kind of faces that didn't blink. My father was already there, rigid in his chair. Jaw tight, pretending he wasn't sweating. Logan wasn't allowed inside yet, but I could feel his panic from the hallway. It was the morning after the SEC summons, colder, quieter than any market day I'd ever known. The kind of morning when truth had no place left to hide. Ms. Wynn, the lead investigator, said, adjusting his glasses, "Thank you for joining us. This inquiry concerns parallel trading activity between Wynn Capital portfolios and your fund, Luma Quant." I placed my briefcase on the table. Of course. Transparency is the foundation of Luma Quant's model. I'm happy to provide full data access. He nodded, unimpressed. We've already reviewed the transaction logs. What concerns us are the patterns. Identical trades within milliseconds. Same volume, same instruments executed through overlapping networks. My father shifted uncomfortably. This is a misunderstanding. Wynn Capital has strict compliance systems. Then how did your daughter's trades mirror yours so precisely? Dad didn't answer. I did. Because someone wanted you to believe that. The room went quiet. I opened my laptop, the hum of its fans slicing through the tension. 2 nights ago, we detected a data mimic. A shell entity in Zurich called Nimbus Holdings replicated Luma Quant's algorithms for 14 consecutive trading days. It's owned by my brother's company, Nimbus Pay. The investigator raised an eyebrow. Your brother? Yes. But before you assume, I doubt he orchestrated this alone. Someone inside Win Capital likely leaked trade data to that shell account. My brother's company was the middleman. The real target was me. Dad's head snapped up. That's absurd. Is it? I turned the screen toward the panel. Graphs filled the display lines of mirrored trades time-stamped down to the millisecond. You've seen the surface data. Look deeper. Win Capital's outbound API calls match Nimbus Holdings trade initiations exactly. That's not a coincidence. That's collaboration. The investigator studied the screen expression tightening. And your evidence packet traces encryption header server logs. You'll find the real origin belongs to someone who had access to both networks. He nodded slowly. Interesting. Who? I looked at my father. Ask Win Capital's CTO, Greg Walsh. His face was drained of color. Greg, the same one you praised for cutting cybersecurity costs by 40% last year, I said. Turns out efficiency isn't always cheap. The panel murmured. The lead investigator leaned forward. We'll need those files. They're already in your inbox, I said. Timestamps, routing paths, cross-verification. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room hummed with the weight of revelation. Finally, Dad said quietly, You had all this prepared. I had to, I replied. I knew one day someone would mistake silence for weakness. After the hearing recessed for verification, Dad followed me into the corridor. His face looked older than I remembered. You blindsided me, he said. No, I said. Greg blindsided you. I just turned on the lights. He ran a hand over his face. You could have warned me. Would you have listened? He didn't answer. Logan appeared down the hall, pale and anxious. They want to talk to me next, he said. They think I leaked your code. Did you? I asked. No, he looked genuinely terrified. I didn't even know about Nimbus Holdings until yesterday. Someone used our company credentials. I swear. I studied him searching for a lie, but found only fear. Then tell the truth, Logan. For once, it might actually save you. Dad turned on him sharply. How could this happen under your watch? Because you both underestimated the kind of people you hired, I said. Greed doesn't just sit at the top. It learns from you. He glared at me. You're enjoying this. No, I said softly. But I'm not apologizing for it either. By the afternoon session, the tone had shifted. The investigators were no longer circling me. They were circling Win Capital. Mr. Win, the lead official, said we've confirmed unauthorized data extraction from your firm's servers to Nimbus Holdings. The breach originated from internal credentials under your Chief Technology Officer, Gregory Walsh. Dad's voice cracked. That can't be right. It is, I said, sliding a printed email across the table. That's a message from Greg to an offshore contact offering trade access for a percentage of profits. He used Logan's platform as the conduit. The official nodded. This matches our findings. Thank you, Ms. Wynn. Dad stared at the page, the color draining from his face. His legacy. 30 years of building reduced to a line of corrupted code and a betrayal he never saw coming. The investigator closed his folder. We'll proceed with enforcement actions. Ms. Wynn, your cooperation has been invaluable. Luma Quant will be cleared of wrongdoing. Win Capital will be subject to sanctions pending review. Dad didn't move. I stood gathering my things. If it helps, I said quietly, I'll assign a compliance team to assist with the audit. Consider it damage control not for the firm but for the family name. He looked up at me, then something breaking in his expression. Why would you help me after everything? Because you're still my father, I said. And because I can afford to. Outside, the winter sun was bleeding into gold. The glass doors reflected my face, calm, composed, untouchable. For once, I didn't flinch at my own reflection. I stepped out of the SEC building, the air biting against my skin, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting anyone. Tessa called before I reached the car. They just cleared Luma Quant officially, she said. You're free. Forbes wants a follow-up interview. Decline it, I said. Really? It's front-page material. I don't need another headline, I said quietly. Not today. I hung up and watched people move along the street, investors, interns, dreamers, all rushing towards some illusion of control. The city hummed, relentless and different. Behind me, Wynn Capital's logo glimmered on the skyline like a fading star. By dawn, the story would leak. Headlines always find their way to the light. For years, I thought I wanted to outshine him. But standing there, I realized I'd already done something harder. I'd outgrown him. The cold wind swept through my hair. I whispered to the empty air, "You built power. I built peace." Then I walked away. By dawn, the city was already buzzing with whispers. Not shock, just inevitability. Wynn Capital's stock plunged, clients panicked, and Richard Wynn was on the defensive. Gregory Walsh, arrested in insider trading investigation. Forbes confirms Luma Quant cleared of all wrongdoing. Every outlet carried a version of the story, but they all had one image: my father walking out of the courthouse with a face that had forgotten how to smile. For 3 decades, he'd been the embodiment of control, precision, legacy. Now he looked like a man realizing the empire he'd built was made of glass. The headlines didn't sting anymore. They just sounded like echoes of everything I'd already survived. By noon, the markets had already turned on him. Wynn Capital's valuation had plummeted 20% in a single day. Clients pulled out. Investors demanded refunds. Greg was in custody. Logan was in hiding, and my father, the man who once lectured me about discipline and dignity, was now the story no one wanted to touch. My assistant Tessa walked into my office, phone in hand. "You should see this," she said. She played a video my father outside the courthouse surrounded by reporters. "Mr. Wynn." "Is it true your daughter exposed the breach?" one shouted. He paused, eyes darting toward the cameras. "My daughter did what was right," he said. His voice cracked on the word right. The clip ended. Tessa turned down the volume. "They're turning him into a villain." "He built himself into one," I said quietly. "Now he's paying the price." "But you don't sound happy." "I'm not." That evening I drove to Connecticut, not to his mansion, but to the lake house. It had always been his sanctuary, the place where he went when he needed to think. When I arrived, the lights were off, except for one dim glow from his study window. I stood outside for a full minute before knocking. "Come in," he said, voice low. The room smelled of old wood and scotch. Papers were scattered across the floor, financial statements, newspaper clippings, resignation drafts. My father sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, staring at nothing. "They're forcing me out," he said without looking at me. "I know. The board voted this afternoon. They'll announce it tomorrow." Wynn Capital, without Wynn. He laughed bitterly. "Poetic, isn't it?" I crossed the room, picking up a page that had fallen by his chair. It was a handwritten letter to the board of directors. He'd already drafted his resignation. "Maybe it's time," I said softly. He looked up at me, then eyes red, the fight drained out of him. "Time for what, Clara?" "To admit I failed." "You didn't fail," I said. "You just stopped learning." His jaw tightened. "You always did talk like a teacher." "I had to be my own," I replied. For a long moment we sat in silence. The fire crackled, throwing gold light across his face. "You know," he said finally, "when I first built the firm, I used to tell myself I was doing it for the family. For you, for Logan, for your mother. I wanted you to have everything I didn't. And then you forgot what that meant." He nodded slowly. Somewhere along the line, I started believing I was the family, that the company was my proof of love. It wasn't. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "I see that now." The clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, cold and still. He poured himself a drink, and another for me. "I saw your name trending again," he said. "They're calling you the youngest self-made billionaire trader in the country." "I didn't ask them to." "No," he said, "but you earned it." I studied him, trying to find the man I once wanted to impress. All I saw was someone tired not from defeat, but from the weight of ego. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "What, choosing reputation over family?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Every day." But by the time I realized it, I didn't know how to stop. I leaned back, staring into the fire. You could start now. He looked up sharply. You think I can fix this? No, I said. But you can end it with grace. He stared at his glass for a long time, then set it down. You're a better version of me. I never wanted to be you. Good, he said. Don't be. The silence between us wasn't cruel this time. It was clean like air after a storm. The next morning, the resignation went public. The press called it an honorable step back, though everyone knew it was forced. Wynn Capital named an interim CEO. Investors stabilized. And for the first time, the Wynn name wasn't synonymous with dominance. It was synonymous with fallout. I watched the coverage from my apartment, coffee in hand. The news anchors debated Legacy's redemption and how power always eats itself. My phone buzzed with messages, journalists asking for comments, friends sending condolences, Logan texting I didn't know. I'm sorry. I ignored them all. Around noon, a courier arrived with a small box wrapped in black ribbon. No card, no sender. Inside was my father's gold pen, the one he used to sign every deal of his career. There was a single note folded beneath it. For the only Wynn who knows the value of a signature. I set the pen on my desk next to my own contracts. For a while, I just stared at it, a symbol of everything he'd built and everything he'd broken. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city hummed outside my window, endless and alive, while I sat in silence, replaying his words. You're a better version of me. Maybe that was true. Or maybe I just learned to lose differently. 3 days later, Wynn Capital stock began to recover under new leadership. Luma Quant hit another record quarter. Investors called it poetic balance one, Wynn falling, another rising. But for me, it didn't feel like balance. It felt like a door quietly closing on a chapter I never wanted to write. At sunset, I drove back to the lake house. The property was empty now, sold to a private buyer. Through the glass, I could still see the outline of my father's study, the chair, the empty shelves, the echo of a man who once believed he could own time. I walked down to the dock, the air cold and clean, and whispered to the water, You taught me how to fight, Dad, but you never taught me how to stop. The ripples swallowed the words whole. Then I turned back toward the car, the gold pen still heavy in my pocket, and left the lake behind, this time for good. 3 weeks passed before I heard his name again. It was a Tuesday morning when the past came knocking literally. I had just finished a call with investors in Singapore when the intercom buzzed. Ms. Wynn, the doorman, said there's a young woman here asking to see you. She says it's urgent. Her name is Sophie Lang, my brother's fiancée. My stomach sank. I hadn't seen her since the night everything fell apart, the night she sat at our family dinner table smiling while Logan mocked me like I was some harmless hobbyist. The idea of her standing downstairs now felt like the universe trying to stir old wounds that hadn't even scarred yet. Send her up, I said. When the elevator opened, Sophie stepped out in a beige coat and oversized sunglasses, looking smaller than I remembered, fragile like she'd aged a decade in a month. She hesitated at the door before whispering, Hi, Clara. I motioned for her to come in. Coffee? She shook her head. No, thank you. I won't stay long. Her voice trembled slightly, the confidence she'd once worn like perfume gone. I gestured to the couch. Sit, please. She sat on the edge, fingers twisting her gloves. I wouldn't have come if it weren't serious. Then you'd better start talking. She took a deep breath. It's about Logan. Of course it was. He's not doing well, she continued. After the hearing, after your father's resignation, he lost most of his investors. Nimbus Pay's board forced him out last week. And now, she stopped, her voice breaking. Now he's drinking. A lot. He hasn't left his apartment in days. He won't answer anyone's calls, not even mine. I stayed silent. Part of me wanted to say he made his bed. Another part, the one that still remembered the boy who used to walk me to the bus stop, wanted to ask if he was eating, if he was safe. The silence stretched. My first instinct, honed by years of being dismissed, was to keep the score. He deserves this. He chose greed. But watching Sophie, the collateral damage of his ambition, made the cold comfort of my victory taste hollow. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about severing the last cord of resentment, and to do that I had to confront the debris he had become, not the caricature he used to be. The younger Clara would have walked away. The current Clara knew that true power meant choosing empathy even when it wasn't deserved. Sophie looked up at me, eyes shining. He keeps saying he ruined everything, that he deserves it. I exhaled slowly. What do you want me to do? Sophie, fix him. He's 34. He made choices. He's your brother. He's also the reason the SEC showed up at my door. Her voice hardened. He didn't mean to. He found out about the data sharing deal between Greg and the Shell account 2 days before the investigation went public. He panicked because the Shell account was using Nimbus Pay's credentials. He thought he could trace the money pay back the losses and clean it up quietly before anyone found out he'd been negligent with company data. Quietly, I repeated. The Wynn family motto. Clara, please. Her eyes filled again. You don't have to forgive him. Just talk to him. He listens to you even when he pretends he doesn't. I looked out the window at the city below, glittering cold, merciless. It took only a moment for me to surrender the victory I had spent years earning. The sight of Sophie's genuine distress was a trade-off I couldn't ignore. I set my cup down, the clink on the saucer, a final sound in the long history of our resentment. Where is he? His apartment. Midtown, but he's not himself. By the time I got there, the sun was setting over the Hudson, painting the skyline in bruised gold. The doorman recognized me instantly. He hasn't been out for 3 days, he said quietly. I've been bringing up takeout bags he never touches. The elevator doors opened to a hallway that smelled faintly of whiskey and despair. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. Logan, it's me. A muffled voice. Go away. Open the door or I'll have security do it. The lock clicked. He appeared in the doorway, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, wearing a hoodie that looked weeks old. What do you want? He rasped. To make sure you're still alive. He laughed dryly. Barely. I stepped inside. The apartment was a monument to his collapse. Empty bottles lay scattered on the marble counter, delivery containers stacked like neglected inventory, and the heavy blinds were drawn tight, sealing out the Manhattan sunlight. Are you planning to live like this forever? He dropped onto the couch. Don't act like you care. I don't have to act, I said. I'm here. To ask why you didn't tell me about Greg once you knew the shell was active. He froze. Sophie told you? Yeah. So I was going to, he said, his voice weak with shame. But I found out 2 days before the news broke. The account had already mirrored Lumaquant's trades. I saw the connection back to Nimbus Pay's back-end credentials. I thought if I exposed Greg Dad's firm would collapse instantly. If I could just quietly trace the funds and close the shell before the SEC got involved, I thought I could save the company and save myself from Dad's fury for my terrible security oversight. You'd save the family name, I finished. He looked up at me, shame written across his face. I've been trying to save that name my whole life, Clara. You're not the only one who grew up in his shadow. I stared at him. You think I don't know that shadow? I lived in it too. The only difference is I stopped mistaking it for light. He sank deeper into the couch. It's over for me. I'm broke. My company's gone. Sophie's barely talking to me. Dad won't even answer. I sat across from him. You're not broke. You're free. He snorted. That's easy to say when you're Forbes' favorite billionaire. Do you think money fixes loneliness? I asked softly. It doesn't. It just gives you better furniture for it. He didn't reply. After a long silence, I said, if you want redemption, start with honesty. Admit what happened. Publicly. They'll destroy me. They already did. Now you can choose what's left. He looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time in years. Why are you helping me? Because I'm tired of being the only one in this family who tells the truth. That night I stayed until he fell asleep. The TV flickering silently in the corner. Before leaving, I cleaned the bottles, opened the blinds, and left a note on the counter. Get up tomorrow. Call Sophie. Apologize. Then rebuild smaller, smarter. The market forgives those who learn. C. As I closed the door behind me, my reflection flickered in the hallway mirror, older, calmer, not the angry girl who once swore she'd never look back. Outside, the city was waking up again. Taxis, honking lights, blinking life moving forward. And for the first time since all of it began, I realized revenge had already served its purpose. It wasn't about destroying them anymore. It was about freeing myself from the weight of being right. The night wind caught my hair as I whispered almost to no one. The market crashes. It recovers. So can we. The invitation came handwritten, sealed in a cream envelope with my father's signature across the flap. No email, no text, just ink, as if that could erase the digital chaos that had nearly destroyed us. Inside a note, Sunday. Family dinner. No business. No reporters. Just us. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The last time we all sat at that table, he'd called my work a tiny side hustle, and Logan had nodded like a loyal echo. Now the empire was gone, and somehow I was the one still standing. I almost didn't go. Almost. The drive to the old family house felt like rewinding a movie I'd spent years trying to forget. Same oak-lined road, same gate, same polished stone steps leading to the door I'd walked out of in anger years ago. But tonight the lights glowed softer, almost human. Mom opened the door. She looked older too, but lighter, like she'd stopped holding her breath for the first time in years. "Clara," she said, smiling nervously. "You came." I did. She hugged me tight, then whispered, "Be gentle. He's different now." Inside the table was already set. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, the same old script. Dad sat at the head, hands clasped, expression unreadable. Logan was beside him, freshly shaven, sober and quieter than I'd ever seen him. Sophie sat next to him, her hand resting gently on his. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dad cleared his throat. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't either," I said. He nodded, accepting it like he deserved it. "Sit, please." The silverware gleamed. The candles flickered, and for the first time in years there was no corporate chatter, no stock updates, no tension disguised as small talk. Just silence that felt almost sacred. Mom started with the safe questions: work, weather, the house renovation. Logan chimed in occasionally, his tone careful, like every word was a fragile investment. Then halfway through dinner, Dad set down his fork. "I want to say something." The room stilled. "I spent my entire life trying to be the man people couldn't ignore," he said quietly. "And in the process, I ignored the people who mattered most." Mom's eyes shimmered. Logan stared down at his plate. He continued, "I thought control meant love. That providing meant understanding. I was wrong." His gaze lifted to me. "You tried to show me that years ago, Clara." I didn't listen. I held his stare. "You didn't believe me." He nodded. "No, because I couldn't believe a daughter could outgrow her father." "But you did, and I'm proud of that." The words hit harder than I expected. For years I'd imagined him saying something like this, but never believed I'd actually hear it. He turned to Logan next. "And you? You made mistakes, but you owned them. That's more than I ever did at your age." Logan's throat tightened. "I almost lost everything." "You didn't," Dad said. "You just started over." Silence again. Only this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt healing. Mom smiled faintly. "It's good to see you all in one room again without someone bringing a balance sheet." We laughed, a small, awkward, genuine laugh. It was the first time the house had heard that sound in years. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The fireplace crackled and Dad poured coffee instead of whiskey. Logan sat across from me, glancing over shyly. "You know," he said, "Nimbus Pay's new board reached out. They want me to come back in an advisory role." "That's good news," I said. "I wouldn't have gotten the chance without your note." He smiled faintly. "Sophie framed it." I raised an eyebrow. "The one I left on your counter?" He nodded. "Yeah. The part where you said, 'The market forgives those who learn.' I read it every morning for a week. Guess I should start charging for advice," I teased lightly. He laughed the kind of laugh that wasn't defensive, just grateful. Then Dad cleared his throat again. Clara, there's one more thing. I turned to him. I spoke with the new board. They're rebuilding Wynn Capital under new management, more ethical, more modern. They asked if you'd consider serving as a strategic advisor. Independent, of course. I blinked. You're serious, I am. I told them they'd be lucky if you said yes. It was surreal. The same man who once told me I didn't understand real business now offered me a seat at his old table. I'll think about it, I said carefully. That's all I ask. Later, after Mom and Sophie cleared the dishes, Dad lingered by the fireplace. You know, he said, your mother and I are selling the lake house. I looked up. Really? He nodded. There are too many ghosts there. We're buying a smaller place upstate. Something quiet, maybe near a golf course. You retire. He chuckled. Don't sound so shocked. Just surprised you finally learned to slow down. I had to watch my daughter do it first. We stood in silence for a while, the flames flickering against the glass. I'm sorry, Clara, he said softly. For every time I made you feel small. I swallowed. I'm sorry too. For every time I wanted to make you feel smaller. He smiled sadly. Guess we're even. When I left that night, the air outside was crisp, the stars sharp against the dark sky. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a battlefield, it felt like a memory. Logan walked me to the car. You know, he said, Sophie and I are getting married next spring. We'd like you to be there. I smiled. As long as no one calls me a side hustler again. He grinned. Never again. As I drove away, the road curved toward the city lights, familiar, alive, humming with the sound of second chances. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was driving away from something. I was driving toward it, whatever came next. The first time I saw my name on Forbes, it felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold in bold letters. But the second time, it wasn't a surprise. It was inevitable. Clara Wynn launches Global Fund to empower women in finance. The headline ran across every major outlet that morning. I woke up to a wall of congratulatory messages, dozens of news requests, and one email that made me pause, a simple subject line from my father: proud of you. Call me. For the first time, I didn't hesitate. The story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy on my own terms. I called him from my office. The markets had just opened, and the hum of Luma Quant's trading floor buzzed in the background like electricity. You saw the article, I said. Of course, he replied. His voice carried something new, humility, even warmth. You're making waves again. I'm trying to make a change, I corrected. I know, and this time I think you'll do it. That one sentence, simple as it was, settled something inside me that had been restless for years. How are you? I asked. He laughed softly. Learning to sleep past 6. Your mother's thrilled. She's teaching me how to make pancakes. It's humbling. That sounds like rehabilitation. It is. We talked longer than I ever had before, not as rivals, but as two people finally fluent in honesty. When I hung up, I realized something. I'd stopped measuring success in dollars or dominance. I measured it in peace. Later that afternoon, I stood in front of a packed press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones lined the podium, and somewhere in the crowd I caught Tessa's reassuring smile. Behind me, the new logo for my next chapter, the Luma Equity Initiative, glowed across a massive screen. Good afternoon, I began, the hum of the city, just beyond the glass windows. When I started Luma Quant, I wanted to prove that intelligence and integrity could outperform ego. I wanted to challenge the system that told women like me to stay quiet, to play small. Today, that vision is expanding. I took a breath, scanning the crowd. The Luma Equity Initiative will invest in women-led funds and minority-founded tech startups, the ones who never make it past the pitch meeting because they don't fit the pattern. Well, we're rewriting the pattern. The room erupted in applause. Flashbulbs burst like stars. Afterward, a young reporter approached me. Ms. Wynn, she said breathlessly, what inspired this shift? You could have just enjoyed your success. Why keep fighting? I smiled. Because success without purpose is just another form of failure. She nodded slowly, writing it down. That's going to be quoted everywhere. Good, I said. Maybe someone who needs it will see it. That evening, I hosted a small dinner to celebrate the fund's launch, not in a marble dining hall or a luxury restaurant, but in a quiet rooftop garden overlooking the city. Strings of golden lights hung overhead, and the skyline shimmered beyond the glass railings. Logan and Sophie arrived first. He looked healthier, sharper grounded. You know, he said, sipping his drink. I think you're becoming the family brand now. Please don't jinx it, I teased. Sophie grinned. He's been reading your interviews out loud at breakfast. Only the smart parts, Logan said. Which apparently is all of them. I laughed. It felt easy now, not guarded, not defensive. A few minutes later, my parents arrived. Mom hugged me first, whispering, Your father ironed his own shirt tonight. That's how proud he is. Dad rolled his eyes, smiling. I didn't want to embarrass the new mogul. Too late, I said. As the night unfolded, the conversations drifted between laughter, nostalgia, and cautious optimism. I caught snippets, Mom telling Sophie stories from her early marriage. Logan explaining blockchain to my father, who pretended to understand. For once, no one mentioned money. Halfway through dessert, Dad stood glass in hand. I'd like to make a toast, he said. The table fell silent. To my daughter, he began. Who taught me that power isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn and then you share. You showed me that integrity and innovation don't compete. They coexist. And you reminded me that the quietest person in the room might just be the one building the future. He looked at me, then eyes steady. Clara, you've carried this family farther than I ever did. Thank you. The applause was soft but sincere. I lifted my glass, swallowing the lump in my throat. To second chances, I said. Mom smiled. And to third helpings. Laughter broke the tension, and for the first time the clinking of glasses sounded like forgiveness. Later, when the guests had gone and the night quieted, I stayed on the rooftop alone. The city stretched before me, the heartbeat of ambition, greed, redemption, all glowing in one endless pulse. Tessa joined me, holding a stack of files. Press requests for tomorrow, she said, then hesitated. You okay? I nodded. Just thinking. About what? About how strange it is, I said softly. To spend your life chasing approval and then realize the only one you needed was your own. She smiled. Sounds like peace? It is. We stood in silence for a moment, the wind carrying faint music from the street below. By the way she said, grinning, Forbes just updated their list. You're not just on it anymore. I turned to her. What do you mean, you're in the top 10? I laughed quietly, shaking my head. Good. Maybe now they'll stop asking if it was luck. Should I schedule an interview? No, I said. Let them wonder. When she left, I stayed a while longer, watching the city breathe. Somewhere out there, other girls were being told their dreams were hobbies, their ideas too small, their ambitions too loud. I thought of them, and of the girl I used to be sitting alone at a Christmas party, mocked by her own family, dismissed for dreaming too big. I whispered to the wind, keep building quietly. One day they'll hear the sound. And as the lights shimmered below, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was the start of something bigger, not about proving them wrong anymore, but about helping others prove themselves right. It had been exactly 1 year since the night my father called my career a tiny side hustle. 1 year since my brother laughed, and Mom looked away, pretending it didn't sting. And now, as I stepped into the ballroom of the Wynn Foundation's annual Christmas Gala, the same room where it all began, everything had changed. The chandeliers glittered like memory itself, but this time I wasn't the quiet one standing by the bar. This time, the whispers followed me. That's her, someone murmured. The billionaire trader. The one who saved Wynn Capital. For once, their curiosity didn't feel cruel. It felt earned. The event was opulent even by Wynn standards. Strings played softly. Champagne glasses clinked and snow fell outside the floor-to-ceiling windows like stage scenery. The crowd was a blur of old investors, family friends, and board members who'd once ignored my emails. They looked at me differently now, with a mix of awe and calculation. Power changes the way people see you, especially when you've learned to wear it gracefully, Clara, a familiar voice, said. I turned to see Logan dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, smiling like a man who'd finally made peace with himself. Sophie was on his arm, radiant, glowing with that effortless confidence I used to envy. You made it, he said. I wouldn't miss it, I replied. He raised his glass. For the record, this time, you're the guest of honor. Not Dad. Let's not tell him that yet, I said, smiling. Too late, another voice cut in. Richard Wynne. He stood behind me, older, softer, but still carrying that quiet authority that filled every room he entered. Except now there was something else in his eyes, pride without possession. I see you're enjoying the spotlight, he said. Still learning how to stand in it, I replied. He laughed quietly. It suits you. Eleanor Wynne appeared beside him, elegant in emerald green, her arm linked through his. She's right, Richard. You're looking better these days. Retirement agrees with you. He rolled his eyes, smiling. It's not retirement. It's a redirect. Redirection that involves golf and birdwatching, she teased. We laughed, really laughed, and for a fleeting moment, I felt like we were the family we might have been all along if ambition hadn't gotten in the way. Later, the music softened, and the MC took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, please welcome our keynote speaker, Ms. Clara Wynne, founder and CEO of Luma Quant and the Luma Equity Initiative. Applause swelled around me. I wasn't nervous this time. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I crossed to the podium. The microphone gleamed beneath the lights. I paused, letting the sound of anticipation fill the room. A year ago, I began. I stood in this very room and heard my work described as a hobby, a tiny side hustle. A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. Tonight I stand here, not to remind you how wrong that was, but to remind you how right it can be to believe in yourself when no one else does. I was raised to believe success was measured in valuation and control, but I've learned true value is measured in resilience, the courage to build something meaningful even after you've been told it's too small. I looked across the room, the same investors who once dismissed me now nodding thoughtfully. The young analysts near the back clinging to every word. So to every woman in this room who's been told to wait her turn to play small to stay safe, don't. The market rewards those who take risks, but life rewards those who own them. Applause thundered through the ballroom. I smiled, stepping back as the MC returned to the stage. The night blurred into warmth and light. Strangers approached me with handshakes and gratitude. You've inspired so many, one woman said. My daughter just applied for her finance degree because of you. That hit deeper than any headline ever could. By the time the crowd thinned and the orchestra switched to slower songs, I found myself standing near the balcony watching the snow drift down over Manhattan. The city pulsed below, alive, restless and endless. Richard Wynne joined me, a glass of wine in his hand. You were magnificent, he said quietly. Thanks, I said. I learned from the best. He smiled. I wasn't always the best teacher. No, I said, but you were the necessary one. We stood in silence for a moment. I'm selling the last of my shares, he said finally. Wynne Capital will be fully independent now. No more ghosts of me haunting it. That's good, I said. You're finally letting it breathe. He nodded, then added softly, and you're finally letting yourself shine. The orchestra began playing an old Sinatra song, his favorite. He held out his hand. Dance with me. I hesitated. You sure? Don't make me ask twice. I laughed and took his hand. We danced slowly, the city lights flickering through the windows like candlelight. In his arms, the past didn't feel heavy anymore. It just felt finished. For once, there was no competition, no unspoken resentment, just rhythm, history, and forgiveness. When the song ended, he kissed my forehead. You did it, Clara. I know, I whispered. We did. By the end of the night, as guests departed and the ballroom emptied, I stood alone under the twinkling lights. The same space that had once echoed with laughter at my expense now shimmered with something else, respect. Logan approached one last time, his arm around Sophie. Next year, he said, Christmas is at my place. You bring dessert. Deal, I said. As they left, I turned back toward the window, my reflection framed against the city skyline, confident, calm, unrecognizable from the woman I once was. A year ago, I walked out of this room humiliated. Tonight, I was walking outside. The snow fell harder now, the wind carrying faint echoes of music down the streets below. I whispered to the night, tiny side hustle, huh? And somewhere deep inside, I could almost hear the universe laugh back. The morning after the Christmas gala, the city was blanketed in snow, soft, weightless, the kind that had erased every footprint overnight. I stood by my window with a cup of coffee, watching the skyline shimmer under a pale sun. It was silent in a way New York rarely was, a pause between endings and beginnings. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to an agenda, an alert, or a crisis. No one doubted me. No one demanded proof. I had spent my whole life chasing validation from Richard Wynne, from the market, from a world that didn't expect women like me to win. Now, I didn't need to chase anything. I'd arrived. Downstairs, my phone buzzed Tessa, my assistant, who had stopped knocking weeks ago because she knew I preferred quiet mornings. "You're trending again," she said, voice bright through the speaker. "Your speech from last night went viral. 6 million views in 12 hours. They're calling it the Revenge to Renaissance moment." I smiled faintly. Catchy. Also, she added, "Forbes wants to feature you on their next cover. The billionaire who rebuilt the family that broke her." Their words, not mine. I sipped my coffee, the taste rich and warm. "Tell them to wait a week. Let the story breathe." "Got it," she said. Then more softly, "You okay?" "Better than I've ever been." When the call ended, I let the silence fill the room again. My apartment was no longer a hideaway, it was a home. No flashing dashboards, no sleepless trading nights, no echoes of anger in every decision. Just peace. Later that morning, I met Richard Wynne for brunch. Not at a country club or his old office cafe, but at a quiet corner diner near the park, the kind of place where no one cared about balance sheets or board votes. He was already there when I arrived, reading the paper, his glasses slipping halfway down his nose. "Still early," he said, smiling. "You're slipping. I'm learning to sleep in." He chuckled. "Good. You've earned it." The waitress poured coffee, and for a few moments we ate in companionable silence. Then he folded his paper and said, "You were right, you know." "About what?" Everything, he said simply. About business, about family, about balance. I thought control meant strength. Turns out letting go took more courage than I ever had. I smiled. "You're catching up fast." He nodded. "You gave me a second chance, Clara." "Not everyone would have." "I didn't give it," I said. "You took it. That's the first time you ever took something that wasn't about power." He laughed softly. "I suppose it's fitting that my daughter's the one teaching me humility." When the check came, he reached for it. I let him. Sometimes letting someone pay isn't weakness, it's grace. As we stood to leave, he said, "Your mother's planning another family dinner. New Year's Eve. Don't make me chase you for an RSVP. I'll be there, I promised." And I meant it. That afternoon, I walked through Central Park alone. The trees were heavy with snow children throwing snowballs under bronze statues of forgotten heroes. Life in its simplest form carried on. I thought about the years I'd spent buried in data trying to outsmart probability, only to learn that the most unpredictable thing in life was people. How they hurt you, how they heal you, how they change when you stop fighting to be right. At Bethesda Terrace, I stopped to watch a street musician play "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." The melody drifted through the cold air, delicate and wistful. I dropped a 20 into his open case. He smiled without stopping the song. The past didn't ache anymore. It hummed quietly in the background, a reminder, not a wound. That night I hosted a small gathering at my apartment. Just a few close friends, Tessa, Logan, and Sophie, and my parents. It wasn't grand, wasn't public, and wasn't performative. It was warmth and laughter, the clinking of glasses and the faint hum of Sinatra playing through old speakers. Halfway through dinner, Logan stood raising his glass. To Clara, he said, "The sister who proved that karma doesn't need to shout, it just needs patience." Everyone laughed, including me. Richard Wynne added, "And to family the original market for forgiveness." Eleanor smiled, dabbing her eyes. "You two make better toast than I ever did." I looked around the table at the faces that once hurt me, now softened by time and understanding. For years I thought revenge would be the end of my story. But revenge, I'd learned, wasn't justice. It was a transformation. When the clock struck midnight, the city outside erupted in fireworks. Gold and crimson bursts reflected across the glass walls, painting every face in fleeting color. Sophie leaned close and whispered, "You know Forbes should call you something else." "What's that? The comeback queen?" I smiled. "Comebacks are overrated. I prefer evolution." Later, when the guests had gone and the laughter had faded, I stood by the window again, watching the last sparks fade into the skyline. The city was alive, endless, imperfect, just like me. I thought of that night a year ago when humiliation had tasted like champagne and disappointment wore a tuxedo. I'd walked out of that room vowing never to need anyone's validation again. And somehow, through every twist and burn, I'd found something better: connection, forgiveness, peace. My reflection looked back at me, steady and strong. The same glass that once showed humiliation now mirrored peace. The snow outside was clean, a fresh canvas laid over the chaotic streets. It was the perfect metaphor: everything broken had been quietly remade. The silence paid in full. It always does. Then I turned off the lights, letting the city keep its glow. If there's one thing my story taught me, it's this: the world will underestimate you until the moment it can't ignore you. Keep building quietly. Let the results speak. Let time prove your worth. And when it does, don't just win, evolve. Because real revenge isn't about payback. It's about becoming someone they could never destroy. The market waits for no one, but the right vision can write its own future.